right, thank you so much. We really appreciate the time that you've all taken out of your busy work week to be able to attend this conference, which I think is one of the most critical to have this year. Global climate change is all around us, and we're so grateful for all of you and also our speakers who've traveled thousands and thousands of miles to get here today and to have discourse with you. So I'm excited about leading this moderation, and most importantly, focus on the talks and then the discussion afterwards and solutions for the topic that we'll talk about today, which is wildfires and reforestation. Just some statistics, and a lot of you have heard about this already, but the global forecast by 2050 is that the population will increase in our planet to 2 billion, by 2 billion. That makes 9.7 billion total people. And because of that, there's going to be obvious a lot of pressures on resources, and the global energy will be increased by about 50%. And because of that, and because if we don't change in our ways of diesel exhaust and how we use energy resources, the Earth's temperature will increase by approximately, and what's been forecasted, by about 5.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Because of that, it's predicted that the Earth will lose about 1 million square miles of native forest and grasslands. Wildfires are expected to increase up to 50%, and of course, the agriculture-associated burning will also be increasing. That type of smoke leads to respiratory illness, to increased emergency department visits, to increases in stroke and heart attacks, for example, as well as many other types of effects on our planet. So there's an urgent need for a call to action by international scientists who you'll meet today, to NGOs, to policymakers, to community workers, to all of us as individuals as well as a community. We need to be able to act together to preserve forests, ecology, and to protect our health. So I'm really pleased today to have you all here, but importantly to have this plenary session as a call to action. The Woods Institute, for example, under Chris Field, are thinking about looking at a new program for adaptation and mitigation to wildfires. And in addition, we have world experts here today to talk about their expertise and, importantly, to discuss among you a call to action. And we hope that we can talk about solutions and to move this forward in sustainability. So thank you very much, and I'll introduce our first speaker. Ruth DeFries is the Denning Family Professor of Sustainable Development in the Department of Ecology and Evolution. And, I think we'll have, thank you, sorry, Tasso. So thank you. So our first speaker is Tasso Azevedo, and he's the forestry and climate change consultant and social entrepreneur and founder of IMAFLORA, which stands for the Institute of Forest and Agriculture Management and Certification, the director of the National Forest Program at the Ministry of Environment in Brazil. We are so thankful for you to take the time to be here today because of all the issues that you've been dealing with on a daily level, and we really appreciate the time to come here. So each speaker will have about 8 minutes to speak and then about 3 minutes of questions, and then we'll try to stay within our 3:05 time scale. Thank you.
Well, it changed a little bit, so. Okay, so let's see if I recognize what I did. Yeah, so I'll start with this. This is like, picture on the Amazon. I'm just going to, this is a protected area, National Forest of Jamanchim. And this is an image of inside this area on April 25. And that's 1st of July. This is 1,500 hectares. I don't know how much is in acres, but in soccer fields would be like 1,500 soccer fields, which is a lot of areas. It's almost like 1 million trees shut down in basically 2 months, right? This is one place. There's several of those happening in the Amazon. The other image is this one. This is São Paulo on August 19th at 3 p.m. This is like not Europe in winter. This is like Brazil we don't get cars with lights turned on at 3 p.m. Never. So this was like an interesting day. Like everything was dark during the day, and it's kind of a shock many people in São Paulo. So what I would do today is kind of talk a little bit about the connection of these two things, how they happen. So this is an image of what was going on with the particulates, aerosols in the air on that specific day that we have the 3 p.m. Blackout. So everything you see in the summary in red, it's smoke coming from the Amazon, Bolivia, and Paraguay, and it's actually meeting with the cold air from the south of Brazil, and then it's basically, we have rain and ash all together, and that's kind of a, block everything. So, yeah, fire, temperature, and so on. So, Brazil is the 5th largest emitter of greenhouse gas in the world today. It used to be the 2nd in the 90s. And this is just because of land use change. About 75% of our emissions of greenhouse gas is basically land use change and agriculture. So we have been very good on kind of measuring, how much we lose in forests, like deforestation. Not so good in terms of understanding what is actually happening. What's the transitions that are happening on the different land use. So I have been dedicating the last 3.5 years to kind of map and understand what are those changes and how we could actually interfere on those changes. So to do so, we put up together this project, which is called Map Biomas, where we have like universities, NGOs, tech companies working together to create this kind of a giant time machine to understand like what happens with the land use in Brazil. So basically we take like Landsat image, pixel by pixel. There is 9.5 billion pixels in Brazil of 30 meters, and then we just take them and try to classify them using machine learning, a lot of tricky stuff, and cloud computing, everything with Google partnership and so on. And then we are able to kind of create maps that looks like this. So it's an open platform. You go to the web on mapbiomas.org. You can navigate in Brazil, not just like seeing forest, non-forest, but you can see like agricultural land, pasture, urban areas, your mining, how these things are actually moving over the time. So you can go all the way from 85 to 2017, navigate it over the time, see what's going on. So I would just give you a zoom in one area here. It's one municipality, one of the 5,500 municipalities in Brazil. That was in 85. A lot of forests. The pink stuff is agriculture. The yellow is pasture. There's kind of a locate. And the red is urban area. And that is like 2017. You can go year by year, but you got the picture, right? This is like huge transformation happening very fast. The idea is that by doing that, you can actually make questions like, how much of the forest that we had in 85 by 2001, for example, is pasture? Or how much of those actually get into urban areas? So what's the trajectory? What's actually happening with all this land is transitioning? So this is like just seeing everything that changed between 85 and 2017. And then you can choose one of the transitions and see on the map what are those transitions. This is specifically from forest to agriculture. And since you have all the properties of Brazil in the platform, so you can see property by property. So you can know which property actually have the change and what type of change when. So that's like how this works. So, cool. Just beautiful. So the idea is that you can do this for each biome. So the Amazon, Cerrados, and so on, you can do for each state. You can do this for each one of the municipalities, each protected area, watershed, and so on. So kind of understand the landscape for the different levels and what's going on. So one example of an application is like look into a watershed. This is like the San Francisco watershed. It's in a dry region of Brazil. This is like the largest artificial reservoir in Brazil, like I think reservoir is the word, I don't know, anyway, dam, like a dam. And this is 85, and this is like 150 miles long, right? It used to be the largest one in the world. Now it's the 5th. One of the reasons is because it's shrink a lot in the last year. So it's basically if you live like on the, at the end of this lake, in 85, now the lake is 20 kilometers far away. That's how its thing is shrinking. And basically this is like consumption of water for agriculture that is happening, whatever, like in the top there is a lot of irrigation and so on. So it's kind of the idea is you can get the picture that this is like understanding how things are changing. Okay, one of the things that we can see using this platform is to understand the dynamics of the deforestation. So this is like just taking the same data and then looking at what were all the losses of primary forests that we have along the years from 86 to 2017 in this case. So you see like this belt of fire happening in the region. I think it's in the wrong order, but that's okay. How can I come back? Yeah. So here you see a map of last week or so. Where is the fire happening in Brazil? So a lot of the fires in the central Brazil, but if you look at the Amazon part, the north, you see that the fire is actually where we have deforestation. So there is this intrinsic link with one another. So there is always this question whether the fire is natural. It could be natural, right? So one fact is that naturally in the Amazon, you would have a fire. The chance to have a fire is 1 in every 500 years. I mean, there's a reason why it's called the rainforest, right? It's kind of, it's humid. There's a lot of rain, etc. So we don't have like this type of lightning without rain. So naturally, it's very difficult to have fire. I have 2 minutes. I have to run. So this is like the fires, how the fires is growing from. This is from January to August on the last years. So this year is starting to go. It's spitting the amount of fire. But the reason why we were so worried is not because until August we were like a little bit higher than the last years. The reason is that because we know the intrinsic link between the fire and the deforestation, we have this map that shows everywhere where we have signs of deforestation in Brazil. And we know that there is this, historically this connection, this is the left side here, is the correlation between deforestation and fire in the region. So it's kind of, and the right side is the correlation of fire and drought. So it's much more stronger actually with deforestation, right? So why it happens? It's because the way deforestation works is that you clean up the forest. That's the first picture there. Then you wait for about 2 months, and in 2 months this will be dry, and then you put fire to finish the job. It's kind of fire is part of the process of the clear cut. So when people say, yeah, but the fire is where the forest was shut down first. Yes, but it was like, it's part of the process, right? So this is one of the things happening in the Amazon. And the other thing that happens is that people, when they put fire on pasture or slash and burn agriculture, they escape to the forest. And in a way, the forest that is stand up is what stops fire to grow, which is kind of sad, but that's how they stop the fire. So this is like the deforestation month by month on 2018 and then 2019. And so if you see what happened is that from May, June, July, it's simply absurdly growth on the last month. So what we are seeing burning on August was what was cut down on March, April, May, and June. So those of us that's actually tracking deforestation, we are seeing like we were in August, and we were seeing that deforestation in July and August was much higher than what we had before. So the signs that we had is that this will be a total disaster in terms of material that will be ready to burn in a few weeks and months. So, yeah, fire, all this, like, climate, ignition, fuel. We have enough fuel. We have the climate dry. So the only thing we can do is actually try to stop ignition. That's the only thing we can do, like, on the scale of the problem. So that's why you heard about this ban on use of fire last week. So we work very strongly to get this for the 60 days, a very dramatic kind of call, because you have to stop on use of fire on basically all types of operations. So we did that. The fires are actually stabilized. So we a little bit declining this week and last week. But what we have to work right now is actually to decrease the amount of fuel that we will have for the next years, right? So, yeah, so we have to work to, let's do this. Do a lot of stuff that is related to decrease deforestation. So I've not got into that, but it's like, there is a list of things that we know that works. But the important thing is, like, we don't need to clear-cut forests. That's the most important message. Like, and the reason for that, and that we learned this by doing all this analysis of what happened with the area that was clear-cut. This is the real numbers. Like, if you take all the areas that were clear-cut in Brazil from 85 to now, 63% is converted into pasture, but this type of pasture, like 1 animal per hectare, very low productivity, degradation of the land. 23% is abandoned. I mean, you clear-cut a forest and then you abandon the forest, and only 14% get to something really productive. So the main reason for having deforestation in Brazil is actually occupy the land. It has nothing to do with, like, increasing production, productivity, and so on. So that's, I think, our challenge right now. Okay, stop the fire, ignition, etc. But we have to really fight to get this deforestation down, so we will not have the sufficient material to burn next year. Thank you.
So we're going to continue on with our speakers and then have questions for the end with the panel. So Ruth DeFries is the Denning Family Professor of Sustainable Development in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology at Columbia University. Thank you so much, Ruth, and she'll talk about her knowledge and expertise in the area of East Asia.
Thank you, Carrie. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this inspiring gathering. We're now going to go halfway around the world, but we're going to stay in the tropics. Yesterday afternoon, we heard from Emanuela, I don't know where you are, Emanuela, about the incredibly brave work that the Dayak indigenous peoples are doing to protect their home from being destroyed by the fires that happen in Southeast Asia. So I'm going to share with you in these brief moments a collaboration which has been led by none other than our very own Sam Myers to try to develop some tools that can help in reducing the impact of these fires on human health. And I'll get back to that collaboration in a moment. So Emanuela told us about the fires in 2015 and showed us the video. This is what those fires in 2015 looked like from space. There was smoke that was blanketing the entire region and millions of people who were breathing that smoke. And this happens every year, particularly in dry years, El Nino years, when conditions lead to a lot of burning, the smoke is particularly bad, and 2015 was one of those years. So here we see where the fires are burning in Indonesia and Equatorial Asia, and they're burning in the peatlands, in the places where there are thick stores of lots of carbon to be burned. But the smoke is traveling long distances. So for those people sitting in the seats of power in Jakarta, the current capital of Indonesia on the island of Java, they're not breathing this smoke. The arrows on this map are showing the direction of the wind. So the wind is blowing the other way. So they're not feeling the impact of these fires. Singapore is feeling the impact, and this is an issue of great political dispute about the smoke that is blowing over into Singapore. It's very important to note that these fires are not natural. As Tasso told us about the rainforest, fires are not a common occurrence. These fires are caused by land clearing, land management, some sort of human ignition, but they are not a natural part of the system as they are in where we sit right now, in the American West, and we'll hear later about that. In Southeast Asia, the peatlands are the source for the large majority of the emissions, and those are coming from a small land area. These are peat sources which built up over geologic time, and for agriculture on peatlands, the practice is to drain them, to build canals, and to drain them so they're dry enough to clear. This is the same process that happened in the prairies of North America. So when those stores of carbon catch fire, they burn and they burn and they burn. Those fires can go on for months, and smoldering fires, which puts out a lot of particulate matter, very unhealthy, as you all know, for people breathing it downwind. When 2015 came around, this group of collaborators had been working on this issue for a couple of years. So when those fires were so particularly severe in 2015, we could quickly put together our methods and our tools to identify where the fires were occurring, where the emissions were going in the atmosphere, who was being affected, and what was the health burden of that. So we put out a paper which estimated the number of excess premature deaths from that 2015 episode. And the number was large, on the order of 100,000 people, excess deaths in the year following the fires. That's a very big number. And this got a lot of attention. So the Indonesian government, the Malaysian government, the Singaporean government all refuted the findings of this study. Now, there are lots of papers out there about the carbon emissions from the fires, about the biodiversity impacts of the fires in Southeast Asia. I haven't seen the governments refute the findings of those papers. So here we are with the health impact, which struck a nerve strong enough that the governments need to refute the findings of the fire. So the human health impacts, which is why we're all here, are so important and so get so much traction politically that distant issues of climate change and vague issues of biodiversity don't get. So the human health impact is really made a dent, and everyone in the region breathes this air and knows about this problem. So what we've done, based on the collaboration that we formed, is put together a tool. Emanuela very rightly asked yesterday, what is your role in helping with this problem? So we see our role in using our understanding of the sources of these fires and the impacts of these fires and the atmospheric transport of the emissions to try to help sort out where would you put your resources to reduce the fires and have the best health benefit downwind. So after the 2015 fires, the Indonesian government put in place a peatland restoration agency, and the role of that agency is to basically restore the hydrology of those drained peatlands, to dam those canals and re-wet them so the fires do not occur. So there's a question, where's the best place to put the priority for that peatland restoration? there are limited resources, so it can't be everywhere. We put together this tool, working with the Peatland Restoration Agency, to allow some understanding and testing of scenarios. If you put out the fires in the peatlands, if you put out the fires in the protected areas, if you put out the fires in oil palm concessions or timber concessions, how much health benefit would there be in terms of excess deaths that did not occur because the fires were put out in those places? That's not to say where the fires are occurring, but where's the impact of those fires downwind. So this is a tool that is now publicly available through the graces of Google Earth Engine, and you can go on it and play around with it and put out fires in different, hypothetically, in different parts of the landscape and see what the impact is on mortality for people living downwind of those fires. We call that the smoke policy tool. And in this case, the direct application of this tool is with the Peatland Restoration Agency to prioritize where they can focus their limited resources on peatland restoration to have the most impact downwind. So this is a paradigm shift. This is saying focus the efforts on putting out the fires, not necessarily where there are the most fires occurring, but where the health benefit downwind would occur from those fires. So it depends where the wind blows and where the people are. So this is a kind of policy tool that could be applied in any situation where there is this downwind impact of fire emissions. For example, in Sao Paulo that Tasso just showed us, in California, in North India, many places around the world where people are breathing and suffering from poor air quality because of fires upwind. So, what do we learn from this for our planetary health moving forward? Certainly, we've learned that disciplines need to work together. Sam brought together multiple disciplines that are relevant for this problem. The land use remote sensing side, that's the side I come from, the atmospheric modelers, atmospheric chemists who know how to project where the emissions go, and the public health people who have the epidemiology tools to say how many people, what's the health burden from the fires. So this, for me, has been one of the best interdisciplinary collaborations I've ever participated in. I've learned so much. And one thing that I've learned is every problem that we deal with in planetary health is going to require a different combination of disciplines. And we have to come at these problems not from putting our own discipline into the problem, but thinking from the perspective of the problem. What are the disciplines that are required? And also, very importantly, for this collaboration is the participation of the Peatland Restoration Agency, because we can build these tools, we can get these things in Google Earth Engine, they're fun to play around with, but if no one is going to use them and no one is going to make decisions based on these tools, then we're having fun, but we're not fulfilling our responsibility in the role that Emanuela reminded us that we all have. Another aspect that I think we will learn and comes out from this session is that when we think about applying our tools to reduce the health burden from fire emissions, we need to think about targeting the solutions to the fire regime of each place. So in this Southeast Asia example, the regime is that the fires are occurring mostly on these peatlands. They are not natural fires. They're related to land clearing and land management. In the Amazon, the fires, as we heard from Tasso, are very much related to deforestation, also not naturally caused. In northern India, where we have health impacts from agricultural burning, that's a different kind of system. So we can apply the same sort of tools, but modified to the regime in each place. In California, as we'll hear about, fires are a part of the natural system, and the fires are partially a result of fire suppression. So it's a different configuration of the tools, but the principle still applies that we can put our disciplines together from the health side, from the land use side, from the atmospheric modeling side to do what we can do and reduce the health burden from fires for the people who are living downwind. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. John Baum, who is currently a professor in the divisions of Occupational Environmental Medicine and Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. He's also a professor at UCSF as well as UC Berkeley, and it's our great pleasure to have him here today to talk about how we can adapt on the individual level to fire exposure. Thank you.
Thank you, Kari. And this slide shows my multiple hats. One reason I was asked to speak today is that I'm the physician member of the California Air Resources Board. How many of you know what the California Air Resources Board actually is? That's better than most crowds. So we have responsibility, state agency, for dealing with both air quality and climate change mitigation, not necessarily adaptation. And I'm actually happy to say that my agency is now dealing with poor air quality from wildfires. We used to say, oh, that's a natural problem, that's somebody else's problem. But given how bad the air quality has been because of catastrophic fires the last couple of years, we've picked up on this. And I also have to mention the joint medical program that I run. It's a really fabulous medical education program with fabulous students. And one graduate and one current student are in the audience, so I thank them for being here. So you've heard from both Tahoe and Ruth about the bad air quality in Sao Paulo, in Singapore, as a result of either wildfires in the rainforest or fires in the peatlands in Indonesia. I'm going to be talking about the public health response to that bad air quality. And I guess another reason I was asked to speak here today is after the Camp Fire last year in November of 2018, I think I did 32 media interviews with regard to how the public should be concerned about the bad air quality. And I would just start off by saying we need, and I'm mentioning public health here, but I totally agree with Ruth, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches are needed for the response to wildfire. We won't be able to implement public health policies unless we know exactly when and where the fires are going to occur and where the smoke is going, et cetera. So I really applaud the work of both Tahoe and Ruth in trying to help us learn that. And this is a document that just actually came out in a new edition, Wildfire Smoke, a Guide for Public Health Officials. This is a joint effort of US EPA, the CDC, the California Department of Public Health, and the California Air Resources Board, among others, to try to get a message out to the people that then will message to the public. And this is just an example of information that's in this document about people with pre-existing heart and lung disease who are the most vulnerable in terms of health impacts that Ruth talked about. The people that die after wildfire smoke exposures or peatland smoke exposures are people with pre-existing heart and lung disease. And I'm going to talk a lot about N95 masks. That's what I'm always asked about. And they're problematic. So here's a California wildfire. Public health messaging is currently based on the US EPA's Air Quality Index. I'm sure all of you have heard about the Air Quality Index. Actually, USA Today will publish every day an Air Quality Index forecast for major cities in the US, for example. This Air Quality Index goes from 0 to above 300, has these categories. This is not an actual metric of micrograms per meter cubed of fine particulate, PM 2.5. It's an index, and people get confused about that. So what's wrong with this picture? This is after the latest occurring catastrophic fire in California history in December of 2017, the Thomas Fire down in Southern California. And it was actually up in the Santa Barbara area, but caused bad air quality in LA. So this family is wearing N95 masks, and maybe one or more of them have asthma, so that would be good that they're wearing masks, but the kids are wearing masks. You can see that the smallest girl there, that mask doesn't fit her properly, and they'd be better off inside than outside. Okay, there we go. So we've heard a little bit about impacts on indigenous people, both in Indonesia and in the rainforest area. We have indigenous peoples impacted by wildfires here in Northern California. And even though this study goes back to 1999, I actually was a reviewer of this paper. It was a CDC paper. It's one of the few actual semi-experimental studies of how to respond individually to wildfire smoke. Up in the Hoopa Reservation in Northern California, they are frequently exposed to every fire season to long-term fires that can last weeks to months. And so the CDC took advantage of this, and also they took advantage of the fact that there are limited places where the tribal members can go to get health care. So they had pretty good capture of healthcare outcomes. And from this study, there was money to provide HEPA air cleaners for people's homes, and they studied the use of these, and people who used the HEPA air cleaners reported lower respiratory symptoms and had less healthcare utilization for respiratory illness than others. They were also able to study N95 face masks, which they gave out to every member of the tribe, and in fact, the use of the N95 mask didn't make any difference with regard to respiratory symptoms or healthcare utilization. Now, there are contrary findings down below from Southern California fires and Indonesia peat fire events. So the data are conflicting about N95 use, but one of the problems with N95s, it could give people a false sense of protection. They go outside and are exposed more, and if the mask doesn't fit 100%, they may have more exposure than if they'd stayed indoors. By the way, can I wear an N95 mask effectively? No, because I have a beard. But there are data, I probably get about 70 or 80% protection where I wear an N95. So it's not like it's an all or nothing, just so you know. So potential interventions to mitigate acute respiratory health effects. Masks are problematic, like I indicated, especially if people end up spending more time outdoors than they otherwise might. There was actually a fight in Sacramento during the campfire last year. The Sacramento city government was issuing free N95 masks at libraries and fire stations, but the county health department said, ooh, that's not a good idea because it's going to give people a false sense of protection. They're going to go outside. So we need to have public health messages that actually are consistent and easy for people to understand. And I forgot to mention, that was also studied in the Hoopa tribe study, and people that said they heard and understood the public health messaging actually had reduced respiratory symptoms and healthcare utilization. And other studies have shown that it's people that for whom English isn't a primary language, have lower education level, people that are potentially the most vulnerable are the ones that least likely to hear a complicated public health message. Clean air shelters have been advocated, but there's no data to support their use. And there are problems moving people. People have to evacuate when they're in the fire zone to save their lives from being burned, and that's a whole issue which we don't have time to talk about. But moving people to clean air shelters when there's bad air quality is problematic in terms of stress, in terms of getting people separated, in terms of moving people to the clean air shelter during or through the bad air. And evacuation, there's literally no evidence of effectiveness for evacuating because of smoke, not because of the fire danger itself. So I wanted to bring up, since we're here at Stanford, I'm going to talk about Berkeley, and lessons learned. So that back in October 2017, there was the Tubbs fire that took out the Coffee Park neighborhood of Santa Rosa and caused a plume of smoke, which you can see through the air quality mapping over Berkeley. And that picture on the right is actually during a sunny afternoon. It's not as dramatic as Sao Paulo was, because it wasn't as bad as Sao Paulo, but you can see that it's not a sunny afternoon. So I got an email, because I'm Berkeley faculty, from the health folks at Berkeley saying, oh, it's bad air quality, you should stay indoors, wear an N95 if you have to go outdoors, and if you have asthma or heart disease, you especially need to be careful about exposure. But there was a football game that afternoon against Washington State, televised by the Pac-12 network, and they didn't cancel the game. And the Bay Area Air Quality Management District asked them to. Why didn't they do it? Because the NCAA rule about canceling an athletic event is at an AQI of 200. It was higher than 200 earlier in the afternoon, but by 7:30 when the game was held, it was below 200, so they had the game. They didn't cancel classes, despite a lot of concern about that, but they learned a lesson. So the next year, during the campfire, when we had much worse air quality, you can see the plume of smoke going right down the Central Valley and out the Bay Area. And now this is a picture on November 15th of the air. It's more like Sao Paulo, right? So this time, they canceled the big game with Stanford. They postponed it, actually. They canceled classes, but they didn't close campus. Why didn't they close campus? I actually there was a joint medical program research symposium that we held that day in a very clean building, because some of the best places to be during bad air quality are in a brand new building that has excellent air filtration. So they learned a lesson. I'll just end up with some big pictures. So when do we need to alert the public? When the air quality is bad enough to alert the public. And that's going to be better predicted all the time with the satellite and remote sensing regimes that are being developed. There's actually going to be an app that the California Air Resources Board is going to be producing about alerting people. Who? The most vulnerable, people with pre-existing heart and lung disease, the very young, the very old. Not everybody needs to wear an N95 mask. It's actually, you can if you want, but only the people that really need to. And that's an issue in terms of getting these out to people. So staying indoors, closing your windows, turning on a recirculating ventilation system that has an adequate filter, MIRV filter, MERV filter greater than 13, or room level HEPA filters. I just told you sort of what. School preparedness is one area that I'm working on. So UCSF, for example, has a wildfire response task force. We're unveiling next Monday, the 16th, this response. And what UCSF's done that I'm very pleased about, and Stanford is going to learn from us, is we've gone through and shown and tested all the buildings in terms of what their air filtration capabilities are, so we know which buildings are safe for people to stay on and which ones aren't. And then you probably have heard that Cal OSHA has just come out with an emergency standard for outdoor worker protection, where when the AQI gets above 150, that N95 masks have to be offered to workers. They don't have to wear them if they don't want to. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Our last speaker is Alison Wolf. She's the founder and CEO of Vibrant Planet. We're so excited to have you here today. And Alison is engaging across communities, across NGOs, across academics, across company, and reaching across the aisle to be able to link us all together. And in that, she'll also talk about remote sensing programs that hopefully will be applied globally. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am truly humbled to be on this panel. I just want to point out that this guy here, Tahoe, is the one that got the moratorium on burning in Brazil a week ago. So I'm feeling quite privileged to sit next to him to talk about fire. So I'm going to share with you the situation here in California and the western U.S., but it's also what's happening up in Alaska, the boreal, in Mediterranean forests throughout Europe, Australia. So it's the dry forest problem. And like Ruth said, these are ecosystems that need fire. They have adapted to fire for many, many thousands of years, very different than rainforests that are not supposed to have any fire. So, as Kari said, the best way to describe what I do is I essentially wire teams together and funders to get things done in the world that need to get done. I work on climate change communications, and then through some work I did with a family in Silicon Valley, dove very deeply for about a year into the wildfire issue in California and the West to try to understand why are our forests literally exploding today. And starting to dig into what are the solutions to that, and there actually are solutions. So I'm curious, how many of you know, be honest, that California's forests store more carbon than tropical rainforests? Anyone know that? I see one hand, two hands. So when I learned that, I've worked on climate change for a long time, and I did not know that. The root systems go extremely deep to get to the water because these are dry ecosystems. So most of the trees, even those giant trees, are below the ground, and they're pulling mass amounts of carbon down with them. The other thing I learned is that half of California's water comes from the forest, from forested areas. So every other sip you take, if you live here in Palo Alto or you live down in Los Angeles, comes from the forest. So these trees are storing snow up in the Sierra and other mountainous areas of California and slowly filtering it. It's also our filtration system for that water, and then bringing it down to this massive ag system and all of these urban areas for 40 million people. So what's happening is we are losing our forests. So climate change, the drought that we're seeing, California has 150 million dead trees is the estimate. We're actually doing the team I'm working with is doing a new tree mortality estimate now for the USDA. And then also disease and wildfire. So the acreage of wildfire that we're seeing is going to double every year until the forests are basically gone. So California could lose 2/3 of its 33 million acres of forest in the next 15, 20 years. So this is a huge catastrophe that no one's talking about, no one really knows about. I've talked to executives in Nestle and Pepsi about what's going on and the impact that this could have on the ag system, and they have no idea. So again, there is a way to solve this. The root cause is not climate change, it's actually land management problems, which I'll get into quickly, but this is turning into a climate catastrophe. So last year's fires emitted 68 billion tons of carbon, and that's the equivalent of powering the entire state, the world's 5th largest economy for an entire year. So it's the same footprint in one year, in one fire season. And again, that's gonna double year upon year. And then, once we lose these trees, part of the problem, which I'll explain with megafire, this new kind of fire that we have never seen before, is that the fires burn so hot because they're overfueled and we've got climate-fueled winds coming off the desert, that it fries the seed stock. So it sterilizes soil and those trees don't come back. So the scientists that I've been working with are seeing these mass conversions of big trees, the best carbon storage machines we could possibly ever dream up, into brush and grasslands that just don't store nearly as much carbon. We lose the water storage and filtration system. We're losing that incredible biodiversity, the owl habitat that so many have fought for over the years, all these different things, these places that we love to play in. We're also losing lives. So this is a picture, one of the horrible pictures we saw of people trying to get out of the Paradise area during the campfire just a little bit west of here that we heard about. This is a picture of San Francisco on that day, like we've seen of other pictures of what everyone was breathing, and we know those health impacts are absolutely horrific from Kari's work and others. These are workers in Oxnard who worked for 17 days in that smoke, and we don't even know what the long-term impacts of that is going to be. So this is what most of our California forests and western forests look like. I actually live in Tahoe now to work on this issue. And people come up to Tahoe and they see these luscious, thick forests, which the beetle kill's coming, sadly. And they think that that's normal. They think that's a pretty forest. I now drive around Tahoe thinking, oh my God, this is an absolute nightmare. So when John Muir arrived, when John Muir arrived, he did not arrive to forests that looked like this. These forests are not normal, and they are not resilient to climate change, disease, and megafire. This is actually a forest that is some semblance of what our forests in the Sierra Nevada should look like. So this is a forest in northern Baja, Mexico. It has never been logged. It has had cultural fire still to this day for many thousands of years. And you can see how spaced out this forest is. There's small trees, there's big trees, and there's very, very little ground cover. And this forest is a model for people at Berkeley, actually, Scott Stevens and some others, as they start to think about what kind of forest. It's the same species we have in the Sierra, but they're adapted to warmer temperatures and drier precipitation. And so they're looking at this as one model for what we need to do to restore forests. So we can actually restore forests and get them back to this kind of structure if we rally enough money and people to actually do the work. So I just want to quickly take you through, on this journey that I've been on for a year, I've started to understand, how did we get here? Why are our forests so messed up? And so I just want to take you through just a couple of the things that I've learned, and I've sort of boiled it down to we've made 5 really huge mistakes over the last couple hundred years. So this is a real sketch from when European Americans arrived in the West. So you can see it's huge trees. I mean, in Tahoe, they were 100-foot diameter trees mostly, and there'd be a few babies, and then mostly clear ground cover. So part of the reason for the clear ground cover was cultural fire. So it's hard for people to wrap their heads around the fact that Native Americans were using fire to manage forests for 20,000 years. So they would come up into the forested areas in the hills, and in the fall, they would set fire to the ground, and then they would leave. And so the whole system between lightning-caused fires and cultural fire adapted to fire. And so it needs fire. So the seeds on some of the pine cone species and berries only pop when the temperature is just right on the fire. Some of the pine cones are round so that they roll and they spread more fire through the forest. So the whole system is adapted there. And so our first big mistake is we moved the people that were tending this land with fire for all these years. Our second mistake is we clear-cut the entire West. So the other thing people cannot get their head around is there's really only 3 to 4% of old growth left in the American West. So we literally flattened every forest you've ever been in from Colorado, Idaho, and all the way west. We took down pretty much every tree, and the American economy was essentially built with those trees. So mostly they were used in mines. The amount of wood that was used to build mines and railroads and then buildings. Of course, back then, whole towns were built from wood. And then in the 40s, we started building our second homes. We became pretty wealthy based on that American economy based on wood, and then later oil and gas. And so we started building second homes. And where were we building them? We were building them in the forest, in this place that has always had fire and needs fire, and now we have homes there. So this is another new aha for me. So The Japanese during World War II were sending hot air balloons over to the Sierra Nevada to set the wood on fire to take a hit on our American economy built on wood. So they were taking trees out, and that was when we first declared war on fire, and we started to call in the airplanes to put fires out with water. Over time, as more and more people moved up to the woods, we got better and better at the technology to suppress fire. And so what's happened now is we've been suppressing fire for 130 years. And that has created a huge amount of ground fuels that ladders up to create these mega fires. How many of you remember Julia Butterfly Hill sitting in Luna? So this is a woman who was an activist, and she went up to so the last few giants were left, and she chained herself to this tree and lived there for over a year. And as a result of the environmentalism in the late 90s, they won, and it was good that they won. They saved some of the last giants, but as a result, the timber industry in California especially was decimated, and it pretty much stopped. So these very strong environmental regulations were put in place, and then California layered a second layer of environmental regulations so that pretty much the timber industry was halted. And that was a really good thing, again, for the big trees. But what happened with that is anyone that knew anything about forest ecology and forestry and actually tending forests left California. So we basically had a collapse of the timber industry. And so the last mistake I would say that we made is instead of retooling the wisdom that we had in those forest ecologists and those foresters into a group of people that could tend to the forest again with fire and thin out some of the brush that needed to get pulled out to save these forests, we just let them go. And so we're left in the situation where we have forests that look like this. Beetle kill is sweeping across California in the west, as we all see, and we've got these mono forests that are all same age. There's no heterogeneity, which makes them more resilient to fire and climate change and disease. And so we've got these kind of mono age, branches touching. Fire suppression has left all of these ladder fuels on the ground. And so now what we have is when a fire starts with a PG&E spark or a cigarette, it travels from the ground. Instead of being low intensity fire on the ground, it travels right up into the canopy. You get climate fueled winds coming in from the desert, and you can't stop those fires. So that's only like 2 to 5% of fires today, but they're getting really big. Like I said, they're gonna double in size year upon year, and the health impacts are gonna be profound, and the impacts to so many other pieces of quality of life. So we have about 10 years to get to this. That's going to require a massive scaling of a workforce. It's going to require really deep understanding of forest ecology and how to actually, from an ecologically sound perspective, restore forests back to some sort of resilience. And so one of the things on this journey that I started to see was that we have not harnessed data and technology for this space. So we can pinpoint a coffee shop, but we have no idea what the structure or state of our forest is pretty much anywhere in the world. And so some of us are just starting to leverage AI and satellite data and some of the things that have just sort of come into maturity to actually try to scale solutions to this problem. So I can't show you the slider because we're so short on time, but this is just, so I've teamed up. We've got support from Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. I can't believe how many slides they have been on. They're just incredible in this space. So I've teamed up with a group called Saylor Sciences. There's a guy named Chris Anderson who's actually finishing his PhD here under Gretchen Daly, who we heard from yesterday. Amazing forest ecologist, remote sensing scientist, and AI expert, and then his partner who's got very similar skills, Dave Marvin. And I'm working with them to build a platform that essentially takes planet data. So they're imaging the entire Earth daily at 3-meter resolution, Sentinel data from the European system, LiDAR data, which is literally laser cameras that get down to the needle and all the way down to the ground within a tree, and then using AI models, combining that imagery to basically create a tree-level map of every tree in California. And that's really critical for us understanding the forest structure, fuel loads for wildfire risk, and then also ultimately how much carbon is stored, how hydrological functions happen through the forest, those kinds of things. And then we are combining that tree map with real-time weather data, wind. Wind is one of the key drivers, like I said, humidity, some other meteorological measurements, climate data, population data, and then we're also mapping infrastructure in California. So where are all the utility lines? PG&E does not know, actually, where 20% of them are. We are mapping all the roads and other building and other infrastructure. So that data, that aggregated kind of interoperable data set can then feed into lots of use cases. So we'll be working with Newsom's teams and the U.S. Forest Service to help them create a real-time dynamic risk map that's seeing the change in the forest as death and wildfires happen, and as we treat forests in real time, and it will also feed into all of the risk mapping with weather and meteorological data. We're also working with the Forest Service and private landowners. This is an example of a map that's helping big commercial landowners cooperate with the Forest Service across ownership lines so that they can plan restoration efforts together, do owl surveys together, those kinds of things, finding efficiencies in the work that needs to happen. One of the most important use cases, because this data can scale down to the community levels, we can help at the community level with defensible space. So you can see what trees need to get cleared out around neighborhoods, but then also driving investment in the broader forest around forested communities to clear out some of the hazardous debris in the forest and maybe start little industries around biomass. And ultimately what we need is more fire on the landscape. This is a Native American burn boss, and we're working with the tribes to teach we white people how to actually manage and tend with fire. And then the last thing quickly is on the fire response side, we're working with the intel level of CAL FIRE so that they have better forest structure, fuel load data, real-time wind, which is what they need to more efficiently and effectively deploy resources to save lives when the big ones happen. And then what we're hoping is that they might move away from the 100% fire suppression policy because they'll have more confidence when they know what the current conditions are to let some fires run and get more natural fire back into the landscape. And then we're working with the Butte team after the Paradise Fire now to help them identify current hazards. So after a fire happens, we can help monitor what's going on, what other hazards exist, and help with planning to get people back in. So so what I'm excited about with this panel is you can see with the different platforms that each of us are working on, all of these platforms could be aggregated together into a global solution set for forests, but also integrated landscapes. Tasso and I were talking last night about how forests are connecting to wetlands and ag lands, and so taking a real landscape view to ecosystem services and how we're managing land towards resilience. So anyway, thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you so much. We have the lightning talks now. We have time for 2 questions. Importantly is that during the coffee break, you can speak to the speakers and hopefully discuss a lot of solutions that we want to have in our call to action. So 2 questions. Yes?
Hi, my name is Annie. Thank you for your experience and visualization of this really important problem that we're facing. I'm a graduate of the Joint Medical Program that Dr. Baum was referring to, and I actually was in Ventura County as a family medicine resident during the Thomas Fire. And I just wanted to make another health connection I think people are starting to realize is that when we have a disruption of the landscape with something as massive as a fire, in Ventura County, we noticed that there was higher incidence of a fungal infection called coccidioidomycosis. So this fungus usually is in the soil, and it doesn't usually affect urban populations, but when a fire ravages an area, these spores, basically there's no, plants that can hold them down, and then when the Santa Ana winds whip through, Southern California, those spores get basically lifted into the air, and we breathe that air. And so our understanding of these disruptions are important because they are very intricately linked to health. And I was wondering if the panelists have any thoughts about how immediately after a massive fire, how communities, local governments can work to restore the natural landscape, because I know trees take years to actually restore.
It's a good question. John, you might want to comment on the coccidioidomycosis, but importantly, how do we adapt that and mitigate the issues around spore formation?
I actually am part of a NIH-funded research group to study the increased incidence of coccidioidomycosis infection in California related to climate change, because there's drier conditions and more dispersion of spores in general. But Annie, you make a good point about after a wildfire. I actually hadn't heard that before, so you taught me something. That's great. I actually don't have expertise about how to restore the landscape after a wildfire.
Yeah, we need another whole day for that or more. So what we'll do is, if there are no further questions, we can have the lightning talks. I really want to thank all of you for coming, and hopefully all of you can discuss more after this.